Hello, my name is Jim Toot, and I'm an Associate Professor of Political Science at Central Virginia Community College. In this video, we'll discuss interest groups. Interest groups are intermediaries linking people to government, and lobbyists work for them. These groups make demands on governments and try to influence public policies in their favor. Their most important difference from political parties is that they do not seek elective office. Interest groups can be single entities, joint associations, and/or have individual members. Single entities often join forces in associations. Associations represent their interests and make demands on government on their behalf. The University of Texas belongs to the Association of American Universities. General Electric belongs to over 80 trade associations, each representing a different industry such as mining, aerospace, and home appliances. Many interest groups have individuals as members. People join labor unions and professional organizations, for example, associations for lawyers, such as the American Bar Association, or political scientists, such as the American Political Science Association, that claim to represent their interests. Economic interest groups represent every aspect of our economy, including agriculture, the arts, automobiles, banking, beverages, construction, defense, education, energy, finance, food, health, housing, insurance, law, media, medicine, pharmaceutical, sports, telecommunications, transportation, travel, and utilities, and many more. Societal interest groups focus on interests based on people's characteristics such as age, gender, race, and ethnicity, as well as religion and sexual preference. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, is one of the oldest societal interest groups in the United States. Ideological interest groups promote a reactionary, conservative, liberal, or radical political philosophy through research and advocacy. Interest groups that take stands on such controversial issues as abortion and gun control are considered ideological, although some might argue that they are actually public interest groups. And public interest groups work for widely accepted concepts of the common good, such as the family, human rights, and consumers. Although their goals are usually popular, some of their specific positions, for example, environmental groups opposing offshore drilling for oil, may be controversial and challenged. There are public interest groups, or organizations that work for the common good as they define it, such as for consumers, the environment, or the family, or a form of government. And government interest groups, which consist of local, state, and foreign governments. They seek to influence the relevant policies of expenditures of the federal government. For example, local and state governments might try to influence regulations or the amount of aid that they get from the federal government. And foreign governments might try to influence our defense policies and foreign aid policies. The life stages of interest groups include creation or birth, growth, change or evolution, and sometimes death. As the United States has become more complex with new technologies, products, services, businesses, and professions, the United States government has become more involved in economy and society. People with common interests organize to solicit support and solutions to their problems from government. Policies enacted in response to the efforts of these groups affect other people, who then form groups to seek government intervention for themselves. These groups may give rise to yet additional groups. This is known as disturbance theory. Some interest groups are created in reaction to an event or a perceived grievance. The National Right to Life Committee, the NRLC, was founded in 1973 in response to the U.S. Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision earlier that year legalizing abortion. However, groups may form long after the reasons for establishing them are obvious. The NAACP was not founded until 1909, even though segregation of and discrimination against black people had existed for many years. Interest groups entrepreneurs usually are important in the creation of groups. Often they are responding to events in their lives. After a drunk driver killed one of her daughters, Candy Lightner founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or MAD, in 1980. Interest group entrepreneurs are people who see the need for and create an interest group. She thereby identified latent interests, people who could be grouped together and organized to pursue what she made them realize was a shared goal, punishing and getting drunk drivers off the road. She was helped by widespread media coverage that brought public attention to her loss and cause. Interest groups have leaders and staff. They control the group, decide its policy objectives, and recruit and represent members. People join membership interest groups voluntarily, such as the NRA, or because they have no choice. It's the requirement of their job or profession. With any interest groups, you have the free rider problem, a situation in which people can benefit from interest groups' accomplishments without joining it. There are purposive incentives, which lead people voluntarily to join and contribute money to a group because they want to help the group achieve its goals. Greenpeace, the Sierra Club, the World Wildlife Federation, and so forth. There's a solidarity incentive when people join a group for friendship and belonging, like-minded individuals. It might be the Chamber of Commerce, the Rotary Club, the Lions Club. Or material incentives when people join a group for the goods and services it provides, discounts, health insurance, and so forth. One way interest groups recruit members is through media coverage. Interest groups become involved in elections to influence policymakers. They may contribute funds, make independent expenditures, advocate issues, endorse candidates, and mobilize voters. Wealthy groups may help pay for the presidential nominating conventions and the presidential inauguration. They give funds to political parties because by helping party leaders retain or regain control of the House or Senate, policy-making rewards follow. Political action committees, or PACs, are a means for organizations, including interest groups, to raise funds and contribute to candidates in federal elections. Approximately 1/3 of the funds received by candidates for the House of Representatives and 1/5 of the funds for Senate candidates come from PACs. In January 2010, the Supreme Court ruled that the government cannot ban political spending by corporations in candidate elections. The court majority justified the decisions on the ground of the First Amendment's free speech clause. This case is known as Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. In summary, interest groups are diverse in membership and purpose. They are created, may evolve in composition and goals, and sometimes die out. Interest group entrepreneurs may be integral to the creation of interest groups. Different types of incentives encourage interest group membership, and organizations use various methods to recruit new members. The media are particularly critical of labor unions. Interest groups try to influence elections in order to advance their policy outcomes. Interest groups employ lobbyists to protect and advance their interests. Lobbyists do this through lobbying, informing, persuading, and pressuring policymakers to support the group's objectives. Lobbyists are representatives of interest groups who try to influence public officials, and lobbying activities that lobbyists perform, such as informing, persuading, and pressuring in order to influence policymakers to support a group's interest. There are as many as 80,000 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. Some of them go through a revolving door between government service and lobbying. Former presidential aides are prominent and powerful among them. More than 200 lobbyists are former members of Congress. Others have worked for congressional committees or the agencies they now lobby. These former public servants have expertise, access, and contacts among policymakers. What do lobbyists do? Lobbying is done by members of the groups or association staff, a law or lobbying firm that specializes in representing clients before government or both. In addition to lobbying, firms may offer such services as public relations, research, polling, direct mail, and grassroots campaigns. Lobbyists need access to policymakers in order to make their cases, but public officials are not obliged to meet with lobbyists, take their telephone calls, or look at their email messages. Access is granted when the policymaker has received campaign contributions from the group, is sympathetic to its interest, where the group's policy objectives are important to constituents. Access is the opportunity to meet with and communicate with policymakers. Ensuring access often involves building relationships. Lobbyists attend elected officials' fundraisers and receptionists and hand over campaign checks from their groups. They meet policymakers informally at dinners, golf games, sporting events, parties, and weddings. They enable lawmakers to fly on corporate jets at discounted rates and then join them for the ride. However, legislation has limited some of these benefits. Lobbyists provide information. They provide information about current or proposed laws and regulations that are relevant to the group's interests. Sometimes they'll even provide a proposed law itself. They supply political information about whether the policymaker's constituents would be affected by a new policy and whether public opinion would support or oppose a policy change. They offer technical information about the implications and possible effects of policy proposals. Some interest groups encourage their members and others to contact their legislators on behalf of a policy position the group advocates. This is called grassroots lobbying. Hired firms use data banks, telephone banks, and direct mail to contact people likely to be responsive to the group. Messages are crafted through focus groups and surveys. All this costs money. So grassroots lobbying is mainly done by amply funded interest groups on major public policy issues like the minimum wage. Lobbying the president. Depending on personal preferences, ideological inclinations, and the political needs, the president may be in contact with business, industry, labor, and other interest group leaders. Normally, however, communications with interest groups are made on the president's behalf by individual members of the White House staff and by the White House Office of Public Engagement, and on occasion by the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. Presidents can cater to interest groups they favor or that they have who have supported them, or whose support they seek by pushing policies the interest groups desire. Usually these are policies the president favors anyway. For example, President George W. Bush imposed restrictions on stem cell research, while President Barack Obama removed these restrictions shortly after taking office. Lobbying government agencies. Bureaucrats are important interest groups because they usually have leeway to decide what laws mean and how to administer and implement them. For example, the guidelines bureaucrats issue to carry out Medicare drug benefit programs determine which drugs and medical devices would be covered. Lobbyists for doctors, hospitals, insurers, drug companies, pharmacies, and medical equipment manufacturers contacted bureaucrats directly about these decisions. Interest groups are affected by court decisions. It matters to them who the judges are in terms of their legal philosophy, policy preferences, and partisan affiliation. Interest groups who have the attention of the White House seek to influence the president's selection of federal judges by suggesting candidates and screening those on the short list. Groups for or against nominees lobby senators to approve, delay, or reject confirmation. Media-oriented tactics, including testifying at the hearings of the Senate Judiciary Committee, are often employed. Interest groups in general and lobbyists in particular receive bad press. The media sent out the drumbeat of criticism featuring stories of corruption and scandals in the relation of policymakers and lobbyists. The media's negative depiction of lobbying and the concerns of members in Congress to refute accusations of being beholden to special interest groups, a derogatory term, have produced proposals to regulate lobbyists and lobbying. These are designed to correct abuses, placate the media, and reassure the public. They increase the amount of information about the visibility of lobbying, illuminate the appearance of corruption, and may reduce lobbyist influence over the policy-making process. In summary, interest groups use lobbyists to influence public officials. Lobbyists seek access to public officials in all government branches. Lobbyists try to influence government officials by providing information regarding their group's interests and through grassroots lobbying. Many lobbyists are former public officials. The media are often critical of lobbying, and various attempts have been made to regulate lobbyists and lobbying. The manipulation of legal loopholes and the lack of stringent enforcement sometimes undermine lobbying regulations. So why are interest groups successful or not? The main factors determining an interest group's effectiveness are its assets, its objectives, its alliances, the visibility of its involvement in policy decisions, and responses to political change and crisis. Successful interest groups have prestige, respected leadership, political skills, and ample finances. Monetary assets allow groups to contribute to political campaigns through their political action committees. The status and distributions of an interest group's members also contribute to its success. Automobile dealers are influential and live, as do their employees, in congressional districts across the country. The ease or difficulty of achieving a group's goals can determine its success. Preventing legislation from being enacted is usually easier than passing it. Moreover, legislation enacted over the opposition of powerful interest groups tends to be watered down. Or the political cost of its passage are so heavy that its proponents in the presidential administration and Congress are discouraged from challenging the groups again. Interest groups sometimes cooperate with other groups to help them achieve a policy objective they could not accomplish alone. A coalition expands resources, broadens expertise, and adds to the credibility of the policy objectives. Alliances are often natural allies, such as the National Restaurant Association, the American Nursery and Landscape Association, and the National Council of Agricultural Employers, who unite to oppose restrictions on immigration and penalties on businesses that employ illegal immigrants. They can also be made up of strange bedfellows, as when the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and the National Rifle Association, NRA, allied to oppose the U.S. Department of Justice putting raw, unsubstantiated data into a national computer network. For the ACLU, it was a violation of people's right to privacy. For the NRA, it was a move towards denying people the right to bear arms. Interest groups are often most successful when their activities are unreported by the media, unscrutinized by most policymakers, and hidden from the public. Opposition to a group's activities is difficult when they are not visible. In what are called iron triangles or subgovernments, policy on a subject is often made by relatively few people from Congress, the bureaucracy, and interest groups. A classic iron triangle has been Veterans Affairs policy. Members of Congress chairing the relevant committees and subcommittees and their aides, key agency administrators from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and representatives from interest groups such as the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars have interacted and dominated policymaking. This policymaking has taken place with low visibility and very little opposition to the benefits provided for veterans. Iron triangles, congressional committees or subcommittees, bureaucratic agencies, and interest groups that together dominate policymaking in a policy area, often with little visibility. Whether interest groups defend what they have or go on the offensive to gain new benefits often depends on who is in control of the government. Some interest groups' goals are supported or opposed far more by one political party than another. A new president or change in party control of Congress usually benefits some groups while putting others at a disadvantage. The Republican takeover of the House of Representatives in the 2010 election put a brake on the new regulation of business by Congress, reduced funds for regulators to hire staff and enforce regulations, and limited investigations of industry practices. Crises, especially ones extensively depicted by the media, often involve politicians and interest groups trying to achieve or prevent policy changes. Looking to exploit the horrific BP oil spill of 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico, which was widely covered in the media and replete with images of the oil-infested waters and oil-coated beaches and wildlife, environmentalists and their congressional allies worked for measures to extend bans on new offshore drilling, strengthen safety and environmental safeguards, and raise to $10 billion or more the cap on civil liability for an oil producer in a spill. There's a hierarchy in the influence of relations between interest groups and policymakers. At the top, the interest groups makes the policy. More common, the group maintains close political relations with policymakers. Or the group has an unchallenged veto status over some governmental decisions, for example, over a presidential appointment. Fourth, the group receives some attention from policymakers, but mainly has a pressure relationship with them. Fifth, the group has only a potential reprisal relationship with policymakers. It can threaten to oppose a member of Congress in the next election. And at the bottom of the ladder, rejected by policymakers, the group is left to agitate and resist. Its public demonstration usually signify its inability to achieve its objectives by less visible means. Who benefits from interest groups? In Federalist Number 10, James Madison warns of the dangers of factions. a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Madison's factions are not exactly today's interest groups. Indeed, interest groups, by representing diverse segments of society, offset one of Madison's concerns, the domination of the majority. Nonetheless, his warnings raise important questions about the effects of interest groups. Briefly stated, pluralism is the theory that competition among interest groups produces compromise and balance among competing policy preferences. For pluralists, the abundance of interest groups, the competition between them, and the representation of interest in society are inherent in American democracy. Bargaining between groups and ever-changing group alliances achieve a desirable dispersion of power, or at least an acceptable balancing of the various interests in society. Again, pluralism, the theory that interest groups' competition leads to policy balance through compromise and negotiation. Pluralists acknowledge that some groups might dominate areas where their interests are paramount, but they believe two factors rectify the situation. In overlapping membership, people belonging to several interest groups encourage negotiation and compromise, and underrepresented people will in time establish groups to assert their interests. The advantage of business. An argument against pluralism is that business has the advantage over other segments of society, particularly the poor and the working class. These Americans lack the disposable income and political skills to organize. The issues that concern them are often absent from the policy agenda. Business and trade associations make up approximately 70% of the organizations with representation in Washington, D.C. Add interest groups representing professionals, and they account for approximately 85% of total spending on lobbying. Quite often, a policy appears only to affect specific corporations or industries, and therefore does not receive much media or public attention. The media often depict business interest groups negatively, which can limit the group's influence. Witness, for example, stories about the dubious dealings and bankruptcy of corporations such as Enron, the trials of corporate leaders who have pillaged their companies, and the huge salaries and bonuses paid in financial and related business sectors. In summary, numerous factors determine the success or failure of interest groups in achieving their policy objectives. These include their assets, objectives, alliances, visibility of their involvement in policy decisions, responses to political change and crises, and depiction in the media. Relatedly, there is a hierarchy of interest groups' relations with policymakers. Pluralists regard interest groups as essential to American democracy. Critics, however, believe that business interest groups are too dominant. Business interest groups have several advantages, enabling them to achieve their policy objectives, but also several disadvantages, including negative media depictions. Many business interest groups try not to interact with the news media at all. They avoid media attention, particularly when it is likely to be negative. They prefer to pursue their policy preferences out of the media and the public's sight and scrutiny. Public relations. Other interest groups have the need or the resources to strive for a favorable image and promote themselves and their policy preferences. One way is through advertising. They place advertisements on the television network's evening news shows in policymakers' constituencies, such as in Washington, D.C. and New York, where opinion leaders will see them, and in prominent newspapers. Even media outlets with tiny audiences may be suitable for advertisements. The Lockheed Martin Corporation has advertised in policy-oriented National Journal in order to reach Washington insiders and policymakers. Some interest groups engage in public relations campaigns. Walmart paid $10 million annually in order to counter lobbying groups that were funded by two unions. These unions were critical of the retail giant's low wages, inadequate health care, and discrimination against women. The public relations campaigns promoted the company's positive attitudes and responded to criticisms. A few interest groups engage in advocacy campaigns through the media. A notable example took place during the 1994 attempt by the Clinton administration to change the U.S. healthcare system. Some $60 million was spent on advertising, with opponents outspending supporters 2-to-1. Most interest groups do not engage in advocacy spending. Indeed, they lack sufficient funds to advertise at all. Yet coverage in the news media is essential, especially for many public interest groups, if they are able to recruit members, raise funds, improve their access to policymakers, and obtain public support for their objectives. So they hold news conferences, issue press releases, release research studies, give interviews to journalists, and try to have spokespeople appear on talk radio and television public affairs shows. Their problem is that there are far too many groups seeking news coverage than the media can or do accommodate. Interest groups deploy several techniques to attract media coverage. Among them are the catchy phrase, the telling statistic, the scorecard, and the poll. Charlton Heston embodied the catchy phrase. While he was president and spokesperson of the National Rifle Association, the NRA, he held up a musket and told members that the only way that he would give up his gun is when they pried it from his cold, dead hands. Media depictions matter. Favorable coverage of public interest groups seeking to protect the environment and consumers has helped get their issues on the policy agenda and some of their proposals enacted. The breast cancer lobby is far more successful at shaping media coverage and thus influencing public opinion and determining public policy, including government funding, than the prostate cancer lobby, even though the disease have almost identical morbidity and mortality rates. Disproportionate coverage of a few societal and public interest groups enhances their importance and the impression that each one represents a policy area. Instead, there is often a spectrum of interest groups across areas. Sparse or non-existent coverage of these interest groups mean that the media do not bring their demands, activities, and policy perspectives to the attention of policymakers and the public. Unfavorable media depictions of labor unions reinforce their negative stereotypes. This coverage reduces public support for unions, organizing efforts, and discourages people from voluntarily joining unions. It discredits striking as a desirable or even appropriate way for unions to achieve their objectives. Media coverage of business interest groups conveys their power. It limits this power by framing it as excessive and adverse to the public interest and by exposing some of it as greed and exploitation. This coverage affects public opinions. In summary, interest groups use a variety of techniques to interact with the news media and obtain favorable coverage. These include advertising, public relations, and advocacy. Despite the vast number of interest groups in existence, the news media tend to cover the activities of only a few leading organizations. Media depictions of interest groups can have significant impact on public opinion about them and support for or opposition to their policy preferences. The media often depict big business groups negatively, while they usually portray other groups such as environmental organizations more positively. The overall effect of the media's depiction of interest groups is to give people the impression that the government is run by a few big interests.